September 1938. A child was born into the center of the Nazi elite, Edda Göring. Her father was Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe and the hand-picked successor to Adolf Hitler. The girl did not grow up in a normal home. She lived in Carinhall, a massive forest estate north of Berlin. The walls were covered in stolen art, the floors were marble. Private trains brought guests to her doorstep. To the German public, she was the little princess of the Third Reich. It was a life of absolute luxury built on the systematic looting of Europe. But this reality was a mask. Outside the gates, the regime was constructing death camps. Her father signed the orders, he managed the economy and built the air force that leveled cities. Edda played with golden dolls while millions died. She saw the uniforms, the medals, and the salutes. To her, this was not a crime. It was her childhood. The footage shows a smiling child being held by Hitler. He was her godfather. In these frames, they look like a normal family. But in reality, they were the architects of a global catastrophe. 1945. The empire collapsed. The luxury of Carinhall vanished in a single day. Allied bombs fell, and the Red Army advanced from the east. Göring was captured by American troops. He was no longer a leader. He was a prisoner in a cell at Nuremberg. Edda and her mother were stripped of their assets. They were moved from a palace to a small room in an internment camp. The contrast was absolute. One day she had servants. The next, she stood in line for soup. Why did she never denounce him? The world waited for a confession of guilt, but Edda Göring chose a different path. She remained loyal to the memory of the man who organized the Holocaust. She didn't see a war criminal. She claimed she only saw a loving father. It was a total rejection of history. For decades, she lived quietly in Munich. She worked in a hospital laboratory. She avoided the press. She did not change her name. She did not hide her face. She spent years in court trying to reclaim the stolen jewelry and paintings confiscated after the war. She wanted the wealth back. There was no apology. The sound of the gavel marked the end of her legal battles. She lost most of them. She died in 2018. She was buried in an unmarked grave to prevent neo-Nazi pilgrimages. She took her secrets to the ground. 1. The heir to the Empire of Göring. June 2nd, 1938. On this day, the most powerful man in the German Air Force became a father. Hermann Göring was not just a commander. He was the president of the Reichstag and the official successor to Adolf Hitler. He controlled the skies, the police, and the economy. Inside his private estate, a girl was born who would represent the future of the Nazi elite. Her name was Edda Göring. Why did her birth matter so much? It was more than a family event. For the Reich, it was a national celebration. The footage from that era shows a strange reality. Thousands of telegrams flooded the palace. 500,000 letters arrived from German citizens. Even Hitler himself agreed to be her godfather. At first glance, a happy family. But in reality, a propaganda tool for a regime preparing for war. Edda's world was a fortress of gold and stolen art. She lived at Carinhall, a massive forest estate north of Berlin. The corridors were lined with paintings looted from occupied Europe. The rooms were filled with rare statues and expensive tapestries. Outside, her father wore custom uniforms and rings encrusted with diamonds. He owned a private train and several palaces. For the young girl, this was normal. She didn't see the concentration camps or the bombed cities. She saw official dinners and high-ranking generals. She saw expensive dolls and a miniature palace built just for her play sessions. It was a life of absolute luxury funded by the theft of a continent. But this was only the beginning. 1945 changed everything. The sound of Soviet artillery replaced the quiet of the forest. The luxury vanished in a matter of weeks. The Princess of the Reich was no longer a symbol of greatness. She was the daughter of a war criminal. The camera captures the shift. No more silk dresses, no more cheering crowds, only the gray walls of prison cells and the cold air of refugee camps. Her father went to the Nuremberg trials to face justice for millions of deaths. Edda and her mother were stripped of their wealth and status. They moved from a palace to a single room without running water. How did she survive the collapse? She had no money and a name everyone hated, but she spent the next 70 years defending that name. Edda Göring lived until December 21, 2018. She never condemned her father. She never apologized for his crimes. To her, he remained the loving man who held her in the garden of Carinhall. She lived in a small apartment in Munich, surrounded by the few relics she managed to save from the fire. The story of the Nazi princess ended in a quiet grave. Carinhall. This was the name of the massive estate belonging to Hermann Göring. The residence functioned as a palace, a museum for looted art, and a temple dedicated to the ego of the Reich Marshal. It was a monumental construction built deep within the Schorfheide forest. The building featured endless corridors, heavy marble sculptures, and halls filled with stuffed animals. The banquet rooms housed art collections stolen from persecuted Jews and families destroyed by the regime. For Edda Göring, the setting was not dark. It was simply home. The girl lived with a team of nannies, private tutors, and dozens of servants. Her daily routine mirrored that of a princess. High-ranking SS officers and Nazi ministers walked the halls as common guests. Foreign leaders and German allies attended dinners in the great halls. Adolf Hitler visited the estate frequently. The camera records his interactions with the child. He showed affection toward Edda and called her mein kleines Mädel, or my little girl. Every detail of her childhood was engineered. The regime used her image to show the German people a perfect elite family. They wanted her to appear strong, healthy, and disciplined. She was the face of the Aryan future. But behind the luxury, there was a bubble of lies. In 1944, the situation changed. The sound of air raid sirens replaced the quiet of the forest. Allied bombs began falling on Berlin. The house collapsed. The Reich faced total defeat. The world Edda knew reached its end. By the middle of 1944, the days of glory were over. The footage shows the transition from palace life to survival. Why did the luxury vanish so quickly? The front lines were closing in. The walls of Carinhall could not stop the Soviet advance. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. Thus ended the era of the Nazi princess. April 1945. The days of the Third Reich were numbered. The Luftwaffe had failed to protect German skies, and the Nazi leadership now viewed Hermann Göring as a failure. Hitler no longer trusted his oldest comrade. As the Red Army pushed closer to the heart of Germany, Göring made a final desperate move. He ordered the destruction of Carinhall. This was his private palace and his sanctuary. He refused to let the Soviets step foot inside. Explosives leveled the massive estate. Edda Göring was only 7 years old. She watched as her world turned into rubble. The blast destroyed her dolls, her animals, and the endless marble corridors she called home. The camera records the smoke rising over the forest. It was a brutal sight for a child. There was no turning back. Edda and her mother, Emmy Göring, began a frantic escape across a collapsing nation. They moved through burning cities and clogged roads. Their goal was to avoid the Soviet advance at all costs. They moved west, searching for the American lines. They hoped for protection, but they found only ruins. May 1945. The hunt ended. Allied forces captured Hermann Göring. The military immediately placed Edda and Emmy under strict supervision. Every asset they owned was seized. The villas, the stolen art, and the bank accounts vanished. They had nothing left but the clothes on their backs. The Nuremberg trials began. Edda visited her father in his cell several times. These meetings stayed with her for the rest of her life. Witnesses later claimed she spoke of these moments as pure fatherly love. She viewed them as private family time, completely detached from the regime. But war does not allow for separation. The footage shows Göring in the dock, defiant but defeated. Edda was 8 years old when the end came, October 15, 1946. Only hours before his scheduled execution by hanging, Göring bit into a smuggled cyanide capsule. He died on the floor of his cell. The golden childhood was officially over. What remained was a life built on wreckage. After the suicide, the authorities released Edda and Emmy. But for the daughter of the Reich's second-in-command, there was no such thing as true freedom. The shadow followed her everywhere. Thus began her life in the aftermath. 1945. Post-war Germany became a hostile environment for anyone linked to the fallen regime. For Edda, the surname Göring was not a name, it was a lead weight. The former high society life vanished. Her mother and daughter moved into a small, cramped apartment. They survived on donations. Envelopes of cash arrived from old sympathizers who still remained loyal to the Reich Marshal. It was a life sustained by the shadows of the past. Edda grew up surrounded by ruins. Outside, the public repudiated Nazism. Inside private homes, pockets of nostalgia and resentment still simmered. These extremist ideas persisted in the dark. This environment shaped her. It was the foundation of her adult worldview. The luxury was gone. No more palaces or private trains. Edda faced the cold reality of German reconstruction. She stood in lines for bread. She wore recycled clothes. The transition from Nazi royalty to a common refugee was absolute. The 1950s. This was the era of silence and collective guilt. Edda's adolescence was defined by public shame and constant social surveillance. People watched her every move. She learned to stay quiet. Financial struggles were the new norm. In official documents, she often hesitated before writing her name. Sometimes she left the signature line blank to avoid trouble, but she never officially changed it. She kept the name Göring. The school environment was a minefield. When classmates discovered her identity, the reaction was immediate. Some stared with morbid curiosity, others walked away. No one stayed neutral. The footage from that era shows a different girl. Edda built a reputation for being polite and studious. She was the ghost in the classroom. She studied hard, trained for administrative work, and entered the professional world. She wanted a normal life. But the past does not disappear. Her adult life began in small offices. She took modest jobs working as a clerk and a secretary. She was efficient and discreet. She kept her head down and her voice low. The shadow of her father followed her into every room. Even in a simple office, the name on her ID card acted as a silent alarm. People whispered in the hallways when she passed. It was a permanent state of tension. She worked, she earned, and she waited. But history refused to let go. Edda Göring worked in medical clinics and hospitals across Bavaria. She lived a quiet life. She avoided the public eye. But the peace never lasted. Periodically, the name Göring exploded in the German newspapers. Her name followed right behind it. This happened because Edda refused to do the one thing the public demanded. She would not publicly condemn her father. Other children of high-ranking Nazis chose a different path. They rejected their inheritance and became anti-extremist activists. Edda did the opposite. Why did she remain silent? The answer was simple. To her, he was not a monster. Hermann Göring was a loving father. That was her reality. Edda never denied the regime's crimes. She did not rewrite history books, but she refused to accept the demonized image of the man who raised her. She stated clearly, "I cannot hate the man who loved me." Historians viewed this position as a major problem. Psychologists saw it differently. They called it a survival mechanism. Edda separated the international war criminal from the man who gave her gifts. Emotionally, it was a daughter's choice. Historically, it was an impossible contradiction. This mindset defined her entire existence. Then came the 1960s. West Germany faced a national scandal. It centered directly on Edda. Old laws remained on the books. These laws had not been revoked after the war. Because Hermann Göring held official state positions, his daughter was entitled to a state pension. The government was legally obligated to pay her. The public reaction was immediate. Protests began. People were outraged. The question dominated the media. Why should the modern state fund the daughter of a convicted war criminal? The legal battle became a front-page headline. At first glance, a simple pension claim, but in reality, a trial of the nation's conscience. The country was divided. One side argued that Edda was innocent of her father's actions. They believed a child should not be punished for the sins of the parent. The other side saw the payments as an insult to the victims of the Holocaust. They demanded the law be changed immediately. The footage from that era shows the tension. Reporters crowded her apartment. Microphones were shoved in her face. Edda remained composed. She did not blink. She did not apologize. Events accelerated. The legal fight moved through the courts. Each hearing brought more protesters to the streets. The sound of shouting filled the hallways of the justice buildings. It was no longer about money. It was about the legacy of the Third Reich. But this was only the beginning. The story did not end with a check. The court eventually reached a verdict. The state stopped the payments. Edda lost her official status. She retreated back into the shadows of Bavaria. She spent her final years in a small apartment in Munich. She died in 2018. There was no public funeral. She was buried in an unmarked grave. Thus ended the era of the last Göring. 1945. The Third Reich collapsed and the legal battles began. German officials considered it unacceptable for any public money to be sent to Edda Göring. They viewed her father's legacy as a stain that disqualified her from state support, but the dispute dragged on for years. Eventually, the courts ruled in her favor. Edda received a portion of the pension until her death. Even today, this decision triggers intense debate in German society. At first glance, a daughter seeking stability, but in reality, a fight for the spoils of war. 10. The battle for stolen art. This is the most controversial chapter of Edda Göring's life. It is a story of persistence and moral complexity. The central conflict involved masterpieces looted by her father during the Nazi regime. To understand the scale, one must look at Hermann Göring's obsession. He was not just the commander of the Luftwaffe, he was one of the most prolific art thieves in modern history. Göring's personal collection reached 4,000 pieces. The list was massive. Renaissance paintings, Baroque masterpieces, Impressionist works, rare sculptures, and ancient tapestries. It included valuable furniture, jewelry, and historical artifacts. Specialized Nazi units like the ERR seized these items from persecuted Jewish families. The footage shows crates being loaded onto trains. For Göring, these were not decorations, they were symbols of status. He displayed these treasures at his estate, Carinhall. He often invited Hitler to view the new acquisitions. He flaunted the collection to prove his personal power within the Reich. 1945 changed everything. Allied forces discovered massive depots of stolen art scattered across Germany. Carinhall was packed with looted goods. These items belonged to French museums and Dutch galleries. They were taken from private collections in Belgium. Most belonged to Jewish families who were deported and murdered. Every painting told a silent story of a destroyed life. This was the landscape for Edda Göring's legal struggle. She did not distance herself from the hoard. Instead, she fought to reclaim what she believed was her inheritance. It got worse. Edda claimed that these items were gifts, not loot. She argued that since they were given to her as a child, they belonged to her legally. The international community watched in shock. Critics pointed out a hard fact. A gift bought with blood is still a crime. The courtrooms became a battlefield for the memory of the Holocaust. Lawyers argued over fine print while survivors demanded justice. Edda remained firm. She wanted the gold, the canvas, and the frames. The struggle lasted for decades. Each hearing reopened the wounds of the war. There was no mistake about her intentions. She wanted the lifestyle her father had built on the ruins of Europe. The process slowed down. Then it stopped. Thus ended the legal era of the Göring name. 1945. The war ended, but for Edda Göring, a new conflict began. It was the relentless pursuit of the international press. She was never accused of a single crime. No court ever issued a warrant for her arrest. But to the world, she was the living symbol of the Third Reich's most powerful man. Her last name alone was enough to sell millions of newspapers. Post-war society demanded answers. People wanted to know what the children of high-ranking Nazis believed. Did they feel guilt? Did they defend their fathers? Did they still hold the same ideology? Edda was the ultimate target for these questions. She was young and she was photogenic. Unlike the children of Himmler or Heydrich, she never changed her name. She did not hide in the shadows. The media saw her as a tragic figure. At the same time, they saw a moral ticking time bomb. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, international journalists flocked to Munich. They constantly hammered on the door of the small apartment she shared with her mother, Emmy. The pressure was constant. The footage from that era shows the reality. Microphones were shoved in her face. Cameras followed her every move. She received hundreds of interview requests and invitations to appear in documentaries. American reporters sent letters asking for the other side of the story. Tabloids offered massive sums of money for intimate details about the Reichsmarschall. She refused them all. Not a single word was spoken. No public statements were issued. Edda decided that silence was her only weapon of control. If she didn't speak, they couldn't twist her words. Why did she stay quiet? It seemed she wanted a normal life, but in reality, her silence only fueled the fire. During the 1970s and 80s, American producers tried again. They wanted her for films about the Nuremberg trials. Documentary crews traveled to Germany just to have a door slammed in their faces. Filmmakers kept detailed logs of these failures. The archives contain notes like, "She refuses to talk. We tried again. She declined. Her mother answers the phone and tells us to stop calling." A single interview would have been a global scoop. But Edda never cracked. The more she withdrew, the more the myth around her grew. The German press was even more aggressive. Post-war Germany struggled with its past, and the children of the elite were seen as windows into that dark era. The headlines were blunt. "Where is Göring's daughter? The silent heiress of the Reich. Does Edda Göring still defend her father?" The footage shows reporters waiting outside her building for hours. They stood in the rain just to capture one grainy photograph. Neighbors reported that journalists circled the block every week. It was a siege that lasted decades. The story ended in silence.